Earlier this week, a post was made on Reddit that sent people into a frenzy. Retribution Paladins so far ahead of everybody else? Warriors dropping down the tier list? What's going on here? Well, all this came from a bunch of data aggregated from various sims for each class, and I don't think reality is exactly what they present. So today, I want to dive into what sims are all about, how this data is looking, and what I think is going to happen in Phase 5. So let's get right into it. Before we get into anything, I just want to give a big thanks. We hit 200 subscribers. That's amazing. Thank you all for your support. But now let's get to the topic at hand. So Sims are great tools if you're really serious about World of Warcraft. I use it all the time. I play with it for hours on end, try out different gear sets I'll never have, gear sets from previous phases because maybe something is getting up there, a little wailing berserker. But what do they really mean? What do they really represent? And why are people so freaked out about them this week? Well, I can understand it. If your class has been doing well and is dropping down the charts, or if a class that you should hate, like Retribution Paladin, is for some reason right at the top of the list, shooting high up further than everybody, well, that kind of will drive people nuts. So I want to look at the data that was presented in that initial post and talk about it, and then dive into what I think is really happening here and how we should be looking at this data. Now, one point I want to make about Sims up front is they're not representative of what your DPS will be. It's really just the potential that a best in slot character, or however you have it configured, can do. Now, when I look at Sims, they're in a vacuum and they're in perfect conditions. You don't miss a beat on the rotation. Every cooldown is used immediately when it's available. It's perfect play. And I think a lot of people lose sight of that with Sims, and depending on the environment and what's going on, you're not going to play perfect. In fact, you're probably going to play less than perfect most of the time. With a few exceptions, of course. There's always some boss that you can just plant your feet, hit your buttons, and just do amazing DPS on. So those exist, but they're few and far between. So let's pull up the data and look at what the initial post was all about. Now this here is a screenshot of what was in a Google Doc that was posted earlier this week. However, it was taken down because some people really can't control themselves and start making outlandish threats about this kind of information. I don't think many people watching this here, the DADCORE community, if you will, aren't really that kind of person. However, if you are, get a life. And looking at the data here, they present it in a way that I really appreciate. I want to call this out specifically. So the columns on the left side of the screen are pointing out potential DPS peaks, maxes if you will, for Phase 4 and 5 this gear with and without world buffs. Now that's really cool. Like in a vacuum in itself, that's really neat information to have. It's fun to see your class or the one that you want to main next phase really at the top of the list and things like that. However, there's a lot more to this data than meets the eyes. Now, there are a few things to put on there like caveats, like they're not taking the things like power infusion or squawks, which can make them even higher. But I look at this as a pretty realistic representation of how strong the gear sets are, the BIS sets are, in Phase 5. I want to look at this in a slightly different way than they're presenting here, however. So let me show you what I've done. So what I want to look at was how the Sims are performing with their BIS sets for Phase 4 versus what's actually happening in Phase 4 now. Now, I do want to put a few things out there up front. This is not a scientific comparison at all. In fact, a lot of this data really isn't comparing apples to apples here. It's more like apples to grapefruits in some ways. For instance, the sim is using Phase 5 data, so all the class changes or set changes or nerfs or whatever are in play in that data, or so I believe. Depends on if the sim was using is updated or not. And the data I have is from Phase 4, because that's the only data we really have. The data on the PTRs, I don't trust that enough to use that for this kind of thing. So things are going to be a little skewed here. Also, the data on the sim, like I mentioned earlier, isn't using things like power infusion, pulling things from Warcraft logs. Well, power infusion, all that stuff is in place, so it's not totally accurate. And on top of that, I want data from the best players, so I'm pulling data from Heat 3. Now, as we all know with Heat 3, you have to wear an abundance of fire resist gear, so that's more of a penalty on the data from Warcraft logs than it is from the Sims. So your mileage may vary with this, but I think it's a fair enough estimation on how the Sims are compared to what reality presents. And that's really what I'm going to get down to today. Are the Sims actually fair? Are they actually showing you what's relevant? And this isn't a knock on the Sims either. Hell, I love the people that are behind the Sims. I read the one in like the Paladin Discord all the time. The guys working on it are amazing. And the depths they go into to put in these wacky rotations and all these complicated things to make it work, it's a Herculean effort. Every sim maintainer, you have all my respect. I love your tools and I want to use them as much as I can to find out how I want to gear myself up and what I want to target in the future. So it's not a knock on them, nor is it a knock on any players or anything either. I am looking at data from the number 1 in the world and the number 100 in the world and taking an average of that to kind of make a hypothetical good player, like someone who's really performing well, not necessarily the best, but they're up there. So the numbers are going to be a little weird. I would call them inaccurate, but not falsified, if you will. I'm not trying to make fake data here. I'm just trying to make data to represent more of an average than the extremes. Now, the Sims do represent the extremes, so that's an interesting thing to look at. But looking at something that's a little more average than that amongst the best players, so like a really good player of the game, and see how the Sims differ. Like, what's the skew there? What's the delta between what a Sim says someone should do and what a player can do? So I'm using Golemag as my tank and spank example. So let me explain what I have here. For each class and spec, and I didn't do all of them, I did the ones that had good data representation. I took the data from the Sim, that's the screenshot we just looked at previously, along with the world number 1 and number 100 for what DPS they're doing against Golemag. Golemag's tank and spank. He's pretty easy. People are going to do good DPS on him on the whole. Yeah, some classes here, they may have some issues, but overall, it's a pretty fair example of what a tank and spank is like currently in Phase 4. And when I just took the average of those and just said, that's your average good World of Warcraft player for that class and that spec. Now, there's way better ways to do this. If I was more familiar with the Warcraft Logs API, I could have gone and wrote some script to go do all this better, but I'm not. And I didn't want to spend a million hours on this. I want to spend some time just to get a grasp of what's going on here. But if there's some demand for more data like that or more analysis like that, put some comments below. I'm happy to put more time into this if you think this is useful, and if you really want to drive down into what's going on. So, getting back to the spreadsheet, the delta is the difference between the average player and the Sim. Now, the numbers are showing how much higher the DPS is in the Sim versus the average player. However, there are two cases that kind of inverted that. I want to talk about them really quick. One of them is the Fire Mage, where the average player, not even the world number 1, world number 1 is blowing away the Sim, but the average player is doing 108.2 DPS higher than what the Sim predicts. Now, to me, I don't think this is a problem with the Sim or anything, and I don't think there's any big changes coming to Mage that would make it be that drastic, although it's really not that drastic. It's 100 DPS. What I think this is probably like over-accounting things like power infusions on mages that are making some of the higher end go even higher and kind of dragging the numbers up with it a little bit. So if you look at the number 100 for Golemag, they're below the Sim, so I think that's probably what's going on here. So I'm not really worried about that number. And the Warrior number being 648 DPS ahead of the Sim. Well, we've seen two things happen here. One, Warriors are popping off. Like, they're great, and I knew this was going to happen. Warriors always figure out how to become the top DPS. I don't think Blizzard can hold them back, but they are being held back, and this is number 2 by that nerf to the tier set bonus, the tier 1 set bonus for Warriors. They're putting it for next phase, taking some of their bonuses from 10% to 5%, which is incorporated in the Sim data. So I think Warriors are kind of getting a raw deal. Honestly, I think that's just a heavy-handed nerf. That didn't need to be like that. But overall, I'm pretty happy with that here. I think this is still working out okay. Warriors, I might need to set them aside for this right now. So looking at the data overall, what I'm really seeing here is that average hypothetical player, along with having to wear some fire resist gear, is doing more or less what the Sims are predicting. So I think for the most part, the Sims are fairly accurate. Now there's a few that stand out as maybe being a little more off than others. Maybe the Shadow Priest Sim is a little more off. Maybe Elemental Sham. I'm not going to dig into that right now, and I don't really believe that's the case. What I think we're seeing is mostly the effects of Heat 3 on the numbers here. I think that's really what it is. If we go look at the world number 1s, most of them are hitting or exceeding the numbers that are in the Sim. So I think a few hundred DPS delta between the Sim and what we're seeing here on Golemag by that hypothetical player is probably expected, and I think that's probably accurate. So for the most part, the Sims are doing a pretty good job, I would say. I say they're pretty accurate overall. But I want to stress, this is Golemag, tank and spank, not much movement. You really just get to focus on your rotation. So for a situation like that, I think the Sims are pretty good. But I wanted to compare against one boss who I think is of similar difficulty, but a lot more movement and a lot more messing up your rotation. I want to look what that looks like, because I think this is going to be more representative of what we're going to see in Phase 5. So this is the same comparison, but for Baron Geddon. Now, as we all know on Baron, if you become the bomb, you have to run out for a second. You have to move him around on Heat 3 and Heat 2 because he drops fire patches on the ground. And when you explode, you leave one on the ground yourself, so you may need to maneuver around that. There's a whole lot more going on in this fight than there is Golemag. So let's look at the differences here. Now, what we do know is people are wearing more or less the same gear as they would on Golemag. Fire resist gear is going to be about the same. You still need to hit that 226 for Heat 3. But what we're seeing are the deltas increasing quite a bit. Many of them over 1,000 DPS different than the Sim, which is quite striking to me, actually. I think this really shows how the encounter really kind of makes the Sim give you kind of a false lead, perhaps, where you may expect you're going to perform better, but because of the mechanics, you're being held back by not only your skill and your abilities, but the raid as a whole. Are people positioning things right? Is Baron-Geddon, in this case, being moved along in a way that makes it easy to run bombs out? Do you have to run bombs far away? Are people dropping them all in your path? All those kind of things come into play, which will ultimately impact your DPS. Now, looking at this data really quick, and I want to focus on the number ones, for instance. If we're looking at just the damage versus the sim, there are no classes aside from warriors, but that involves the nerf on the sim, so let's put that one aside for now. But there's no classes exceeding the sim's DPS. What that indicates to me is not even the best players can meet what the sims are saying on a boss that has a lot of maneuverability, a lot of moving, a lot of mechanics involved. And in fact, if we look at the averages here, they're all below, and in most cases, they're over 1,000 below. There's quite a few here that are significantly below what the sims are predicting as being the peak DPS here. So let's look at Retribution Paladin, for instance, where on Golmag, let's flip over to Golmag real quick, where a ret on Golmag was only about 500 DPS below the sim for that average player. If we go to Baron, it's 1,500. That's a significant difference. And I think a lot of that is because most of Paladin's damage is still attributed back to auto attacks and the seals and the judgments and whatnot. So I can see why they're worse off than any other classes in the difference between Golmag and Baron. However, what we're seeing here is there is a limit to how much DPS you can do on a boss. What does that mean overall? It means while the sims are still accurate, the sims do not account for this type of activity. If the best players in the world can't beat the sims where they were on Golmag, and they still are, you really need to take them with a grain of salt. It's really about potential and not about execution. Now, that said, yeah, you want to compete with everybody else on the Warcraft logs boards and everything. If you want to be number one, you do have to execute on every boss and really push things hard. However, don't look at the sim as being what the story is going to be for everyone. Now, moving back over, just looking at the Phase 5 BIS, looking at the DPS rankings and the projected DPS from the sims, this is still the ideal case. This is the Golmag, you never have to move your feet kind of case, for instance. Are there many fights like that in BWL? Not really. I mean, you could say Razorgore, once you crack all the eggs, is like that. Veil, I'll talk about Veil in a moment. Veil's going to be a special case. It'll look nothing like this. So in BWL, there's a lot more mechanics you have to pay attention to. Like Flame Gore, you have to break line of sight to drop stacks of the debuff he puts on you. Or Broodlord, there's a little knockback. The two Horseman Drakes, as we'll call them now. There's a tank swap in the middle there. You have to move your targets. That might affect your DPS if you have to build up stacks or things like that on someone before you can really pump. There's a lot more going on there. So I think these numbers, while this is great in a vacuum, and maybe a Razorgore will see it represent this, this is not going to be reality. And this is why I'm not so worried about what these say overall. Now, let's talk about Veil real quick. Veil is going to blow this out of the water. I can't wait to see what it looks like there, because of the buff he gives you that makes it so you have no resource issues at all. Now, what does this mean? That means rogues are going to go insane. If Backstab Rogue is really number 2 on that list, they're going to just destroy people on number 1. Warriors, which it even says here, they're likely higher than where they're simming. You just need to get 10% off of Veil before you can start executing for the rest of the time. That's a lot of execute phase. Warriors are going to go bonkers on this fight. I think they might actually end up being number 1 once everyone's dialed in their Phase 5 BIS or near BIS. And then look at mages. If they have any mana issues, well, they won't on this fight. They have unlimited mana. Cooldowns are faster too, especially if you get Burning Adrenaline. You get to do more damage for that short window of time. Yeah, you're going to die, but you might be able to pump real hard, harder than ever before you die. So on that fight, this data is worthless. Overall, is it going to be a complete bloodbath? Everyone wants all rets all the time? No, I don't think so. Especially on movement fights. That's going to be where paladins don't shine as much. We're going to see other classes really step up. Hunters, for instance, I think we're going to see them a little higher there on this list too. Warlocks, I think they're going to be higher than we're seeing here. Not on the DPS numbers on the page here, but just on the overall rankings and overall DPS overall. Can I say overall a few more times there? Maybe I can. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave this whole video at this point? Well, I guess my point of this video is don't sweat the sims. Yeah, they might show that rets are going to have the highest potential for the phase, and maybe there's a fight or two where they will, and they'll really blow things away. What you're seeing isn't going to be what happens, and we've already seen this in Molten Core. Yeah, we have warriors at the top now. Who predicted they were going to be at the top earlier on? Are rets going to be at the top at the end of Phase 5? I honestly don't think so, because rets never are, so I'm sure they'll get nerfed at some point. But even with that said, we're going to see some stuff evolve as the phase goes on. We're going to see maybe some changes as the phase goes on for some of the tier sets. In fact, I think just today there's some indications that some warrior changes based on those nerfs last week might be coming in. So warriors rejoice, you're saved after all, hopefully. So am I worried about this? Is this something I would get upset about if I wasn't playing Paladin especially? No, because it really doesn't matter in the end. What matters is really what matters in any raid. Competent players that know how to play their class, people who understand how to gear up properly and do so, people who do all the little things to help them do a little better too. I'm talking things like Dragon's Breath Chili, the potions from Gnomer that give you a little attack power, spell power boost. all the little things to help add up to be even more, and then execute when it's time to kill the boss. If you can do that, you're going to have success regardless. You're going to have good clear times. You're going to have a fast run. You're going to have good parses. So The Sims, while they're great and I would highly recommend using them for yourself, don't freak out about this data here. In the end, it's not going to be about who sims the highest or who theoretically has the most potential. It's going to be about who executes the best and the raid team as a whole. So if you're worried about this, if this is really discouraging to you, and if you think there's like reasons to switch mains, play the flavor of the month, I strongly advise against it. First off, Season Discover requires a lot of investment to gear up and alt. Hopefully with Phase 5, some of the rune changes are going to help with that a little bit. But I wouldn't go to a ret right now if I was playing a warrior, for instance. I think that's kind of ridiculous. I also think that this is going to be a phase-by-phase thing. Yeah, this might be the time for rest to shine. Who knows? But will AQ be that? Will Nax be that? I would bet against that. There's going to be more sets coming out, different bonuses happening, more rebalancing. So I wouldn't really worry about it that much right now. In the end, I think the most important thing you can do is play the game as best you can. Have fun doing it. Do people even do that anymore? Well, I don't know. And start thinking ahead. Start making plans for here's how I want to position myself. Here's what I want to look like coming out of Phase 5. And then when things start happening for Phase 6, the PTRs go back up, start making some plans around how you want to adjust then. In the meantime, if you want to do some contingency planning, maybe this is a good time to level an alt, get in some pugs. Maybe your guild has another run that needs another member or something like that. Go get geared up. Have 2 classes available for the next phase. One of my buddies, he has 4 characters pretty much bissed out from Phase 4 because he does a lot of pugs and he's going to raids, 4 raids a week in Molten Core. Yeah, he's insane, including the world bosses, but he's ready. If something really happened to his main where it just became totally untenable, then he's ready to go in another class, so consider that too. Phase 5 is probably going to be about another 10 weeks like we saw with Phase 4, give or take. Who knows exactly. Holidays coming up in a couple months might skew that. So there's plenty of time to get anything you want done. Plenty of time to make those future investments. And plenty of time to have fun with it too. Well, anyways, that's all I have for this video today. I hope this is helpful in some way, maybe give you an idea of how to interpret some of these sim data better, or maybe kind of alleviate some stress you may have been feeling because your class isn't near the top of the meters. But at any rate, I hope this is helpful. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have anything you want to comment below on that I may have been wrong about, or you think I'm just totally off base on, oh, please do. I love the engagement. I love hearing everything you have to say. It's always a treat for me. Aside from that, if you like this video, give it a like, subscribe if you like, turn on notifications if you want to know when a new video goes up, and that's about it. I really appreciate all your support again, everybody. It's been wonderful, and I'm thrilled to keep talking with you about all these topics, and I hope to talk to you again soon. Until then, take care.